Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar this morning in partnership between Alira Health and the Department for International Trade, talking about the US healthcare market in the time of COVID-19. It's great to see so many participants from every part of the United Kingdom here this morning. My name is Peter Abbott. I am the British Consul General representing the United Kingdom across the 6 New England states here in the northeast corner of the USA. I hope everybody is alert and not too foggy this morning if you've been following the election overnight. It's great to have you with us. So a word or two of introduction on the US healthcare market. Many of you will know that the US healthcare market is the largest in the world and represents probably more than about 40% of the global market. America spends more on healthcare and medical devices than anyone else in the rest of the world. For those of you that don't know, healthcare in the US is mostly private and the market is highly fragmented. So what does this mean for potential investors? It means firstly that there are plenty of sales opportunities for medical device and healthcare companies. And secondly, it means there is substantial interest in new technologies that have a direct measurable benefit, such as reducing short and long-term costs, increasing patient satisfaction, reducing procedure and recovery times, and of course, in the time of COVID, increased interest in things like telemedicine and digital medical solutions. Massachusetts, many of you will already know, has one of the world's most extraordinary healthcare sectors. Around 1 in 5 jobs in the state are in the healthcare industry, and there are 20 hospitals in Boston and Cambridge alone, many of them world leading in their own right. It's also an extraordinary venture capital investment destination with around $15 billion in venture capital investment in Massachusetts in 2018 alone. And it's worth noting that although it's highly competitive, truly innovative products from around the world, including the UK, regularly secure large investments here in Massachusetts and New England. The Department for International Trade team here in Boston, which is part of the consulate which I lead, is a fantastic team, and I'm pleased to have a couple of them here on the call today. They've helped many British companies develop a US commercialization strategy, connect with some of that venture capitalism funding that I was talking about, and provide introductions to industry and regulatory experts such as Alira. They've got a fantastic track record of working with healthcare organizations here in Boston, and we will be sending details of the team around by email a little bit later. It's a great delight now to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Mary McNamara-Cullinane, Senior Vice President for Regulatory Affairs at Alira, Deepak Sahu, a partner, and Aude Ouensanga, a partner at Alira too. Before I hand over to Aude, who I think is going to kick us off this morning, I just wanted to reiterate Marlena's invitation to submit questions using the chat bar at the bottom sort of right-hand corner of your screen. When we come to the Q&A section, which I will moderate, I will do my best to get through all of the questions that you submit. So very many thanks to Alira for having me this morning, and over to Aude.
Thank you, Peter, and hi, everybody. It's very happy to be here. As you mentioned, Peter, I think you said a lot of things that we have in mind. The morning after the election, we still don't have a president, so we'll see how things are going around. I like the introduction that you gave with a few figures, right? Because actually the few slides that I would like to show to you are really around this. So if you can move to the next slide, as you correctly mentioned, Peter, the US market is definitely the one, the US actually are definitely the country spending much more on healthcare than other countries. As you can see on the right of the slide, 18% of the US GDP is spent on healthcare. If you look at the UK, it's about 10%, which is in line with the other OECD countries. And in terms of spending per capita here too, we are about twice as much as other OECD countries. So definitely for all companies over the world, the US market is an attractive market to enter with very specific strategies to handle and very specific stakeholders to apprehend. So we'll move to the next slide. Here is really an overview of who are the stakeholders that we need to have in mind when we enter the US market. All of them are important. Whether you have a drug, whether you have a digital health platform, whether you have a medical device, all of these stakeholders on this slide are very important to apprehend. So obviously we do have the patient. I know that a lot of you in the crowd are from the digital health background, and the patient are really, I mean, I think that the patient now would tend to put the patient in the middle of this circle rather than on the border. And we see what we do have to understand from one patient to the other. UK patient, a French patient, a Japanese patient will obviously do not have the same way of using a device than a US patient, and particularly in digital health, for digital health solutions. Providers, your hospital clinics, but also your physicians, which in digital health, as you know, are pretty important to include in the ecosystem. Your payers, which I know I mean, as you can hear, I'm French and I've been in the US for about 5 years. And I know that for a lot of working with a lot of European companies, I think the payer system is still a mystery for a lot of you, I think, but also for a lot of Americans. So you're not alone here. I'll go through that briefly. Suppliers will be you, most of you, at least, and then the regulatory agencies. Mary will cover the regulatory aspect with the FDA later today. If we can move to the next slide. So the next slide is really an overview of who pays what, right? We talked about the payers, but the idea, I think we do have an IT. I mean, the next slide, you can see maybe some pie charts. The next slide really aims at showing you who pays what, right? So healthcare expenditures are covered. 75% of healthcare expenditures are covered by health insurance, and then about 10% are out of pocket. I think that what is interesting to see is mainly on the right. Private insurance account for 45% of spending, and then about 50%, so it's a bit more than 50% are coming from the government. So the US government is actually a very strong payer and accounts for most of the spending in the US. I think that when we come from Europe, we often think that I mean, it's not the case. Like private insurance will cover most of the expenditure, so it's partially true. And I think that Deepak will go back on how reimbursement works later today. And then the next slide is really to cover very briefly to explain to you how the payment system works, right? If you look at the UK, if you look at most of EU countries, the government are mainly paying for healthcare. This slide really aims at showing at a glance how the US the coverage is organized in the US. So in the middle, you do have the patient. The patient generally also workers. So the patients will, or the employee through employment actually will receive. I mean, their employer will receive healthcare premiums. So that's what you see in the number 2. Healthcare premium are paid to insurance companies, who will actually pay the providers, the healthcare providers, when the patient is looking for care. The patient will also pay co-pays, which are quite significant in the US, particularly when we come from European countries. And then for the patients who are retired or who are under Medicaid, the government will take that role and pay the healthcare providers. So it's really about the patient seeking, getting coverage from their employers, but also directly paying the provider through copays. The next slide is really, and I think that I'm sure gonna have questions on do and don'ts, how to enter the US market. I think that what I would like to stress here is really how to optimize your market access plan in the US. It's really be US focused, right? So when I started, I mentioned that, you do have to consider all these stakeholders into the ecosystem and really see where your technology will, who will be the right call points for your technology. So the first thing that you do have to do is really to have an early market access plan. And this is particularly important for digital health technologies. Understand what is a patient journey, the local treatment algorithm, to define your target patient pool, understand obviously your competitive landscape and partner with KOL. And this is significantly different from one country to the other. And then once you have really this good understanding of the market, the idea is really to move to your regulatory strategy, which should be adapted to your market access plan. Your clinical strategy will come from there, and then your market access plan. This seems obvious. What we often see, though, is that companies will not put in place their early market access plan. They will start with a regulatory strategy, build a clinical strategy based only on regulatory, but not on market access needs. And then when they launch the product, they end up with a product which is approved, but which cannot reach market acceptance because it has not really been built for a specific local need and local, stakeholders organization. A few words on COVID before I need to Mary. So, what did we see here? I think that what we saw in the US was very close to what we are seeing in other countries. Maybe a little bit more accelerated here. So obviously, as you know, all the COVID-related technologies saw a surge of demand. Mary will talk about emergency use approvals. We had some disruption in supply chains, which are now, I think, since September, we are seeing like a kind of back to normal organization of supply chains, less emergency stocking and ways of like really being in a hurry to procure the right product. So supply chains are stabilizing in this new normal. I think that the thing which is very, and you mentioned it, Peter, very disruptive, and we can move to the next slide, is really how COVID actually accelerated a lot of trends. Like, all healthcare systems are trying to get patient home. COVID made that mandatory, and because of that, so many technologies could be launched much faster than they would have been otherwise. In the clinical trial landscape, typically, so many clinical trials moved virtual, right? So many telehealth approaches could find their market faster than they would have into a normal time. So this was done in kind of an emergency approach. But obviously, this will stay after the crisis is gone, hopefully. So I will leave you to Mary for the hardcore regulatory updates and what changed, what needs to be done.
Great. Thank you, Aude. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here and speak with you about the FDA, a little bit about digital health in terms of regulatory, and then the emergency use process and what FDA has done to deal with the pandemic in expediting approvals for various medical technologies. So just a general overview of the FDA, it's our agency that regulates drugs, devices, biologics, foods, cosmetics, and animal products. The general setup is there on the left-hand side of the slide. We have the foods, tobacco, CBER for biologics, CDRH for devices, and CDER for drug evaluation and research. CBER does regulate biologics. That includes vaccines, so that is a very busy group right now at FDA. Allogenics, tissue, cellular, and gene therapies. And then CDER does all the over-the-counter and prescription drugs. And then what we're going to concentrate on here today is mostly devices and diagnostics and different surgical technologies. And these are just the definitions. I'm going to go through this quickly because I have a lot of slides to go through. Basically, what a medical device is, what a drug is, and then, more importantly, what we're seeing nowadays is a lot of combination type products. So those are products that will have a medical device and a biologic combination or a drug device combination, and a lot of digital health and pharmaceuticals are coming through the combination product area. But those are just the definitions for each of the areas that CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, regulates. So there are a number of pathways to go through with FDA depending on the level of risk of your product as well as the indications for use. The most widely used regulatory pathway is through the 510K pre-market notification pathway. And what that means is that means when you have a device or a technology or a diagnostic that there's a predicate device on the market. So there's something out there on the market that's already been through the FDA process that you can claim substantial equivalence to. And then just generally speaking, these products go through with information on technology, preclinical testing, indications for use, and then a focus on what the comparison is with that legally marketed predicate device. Most device types that go through this 510K process don't need clinical data. Some do include clinical data, but it's fairly rare when that happens. The next regulatory pathway for devices and technologies to go through is the De Novo 510K. It's a fairly new process. It's been around about 9 or 10 years now. It's a great addition to the pathways FDA provides to us. And so the De Novo addresses novel devices for which they are low to moderate risk, but there's no clear predicate on the market. So something that is low to moderate risk, but there's nothing else out there like it on the market that you could claim substantial equivalence to like you would in a traditional 510K. This process typically does include some clinical data, and FDA creates a classification for your De Novo product, as well as a guidance document. So it's a longer process typically than the 510K process, but it does address all of the novel products that companies are trying to get on the market that are low to moderate risk. Another pathway that companies are using are HDE, the Humanitarian Device Exemption. This is only appropriate if your technology addresses a rare disease or condition that affects about probably less than 8,000 people per year. So this would cover class 1, class 2 devices that fit in this criteria, and clinical trials are typically required, although many times, FDA will accept a lesser amount of clinical evidence to support an HDE because it is going to address an unmet need. The next submission type is a pre-market approval. This is for a class 3, the highest risk device that there is. And then there's a heavy level of burden of evidence needed. So there's an extensive amount of preclinical testing, animal testing, and human clinical testing needed for a PMA or a pre-market approval. Again, that's for the highest level of risk devices. So those are the 4 pathways to go through to get a technology through the FDA. And this chart just gives you a visualization of the different classes and where they fall in terms of those submissions that I just talked about. So there is a group of devices that fall under class 1. Those are very, very low risk products that there's no 510K needed. There's no submission needed through FDA if it fits into this class 1, very, very low risk category. Class 2 devices, moderate and controlled risk, those fall into typically 510Ks, De Novo 510Ks, and some HDEs. And then the PMAs products are class 3. again, with the highest level of evidence required to get a PMA approval through the FDA. Okay, so just to go through a couple of mistakes that people do make when they are approaching FDA with a different submission types. You know, one is not having a solid regulatory strategy or pathway, not communicating with the FDA early in the process. One thing I did not discuss is a pre-submission. And a pre-submission is a document that's provided to FDA before you go in there with a 510K or a de novo or a PMA. And that document provides FDA with information on your technology and your testing plan. And that gives FDA an opportunity to comment on what your test plan is so that you can understand what FDA is looking for. What are their red flags? What are their biggest concerns? That is where you get that information during this pre-submission process, which again is before a 510K or a de novo or a PMA. So I encourage most companies to submit pre-submissions if there are any questions on their technologies. And performing extensive testing prior to communicating with FDA can be a big mistake because FDA might have certain areas of concern with that testing and companies then have to repeat that testing. So that early communication, that pre-submission document is critical. Some other mistakes that companies make are not understanding the history of the device or the product type in the US. There's plenty of information on the website that allows everybody to understand what the classification is, what are other product types that are like this on the market, and what kind of testing is needed for your specific type of device. Another bit of information that companies get into trouble with is if you do go to FDA with pre-submission and they provide you with that feedback, you need to follow that feedback. So if they tell you to do certain types of testing, the company should follow that advice. And then if something is not appropriate, you just have to have a full justification and rationale for why an FDA comment is not appropriate. Another mistake is just not being prepared for FDA meetings. Companies can go into a meeting with FDA for 1 hour and get nothing out of it if there's not appropriate preparation and rehearsals. And again, ignoring that FDA feedback is a big hurdle. And FDA does remember when you submit a 510K or a de novo, if they told you something during the pre-submission phase and you ignored it, they will ask for it again, and that will hold up your 510K or your de novo in terms of review time. I want to quickly just go through a little bit of software and digital health with FDA and how this is becoming a big area, a big topic, and there are several guidance documents from FDA that cover digital health. So software can be used as a medical product, incorporated into a medical product, used to develop a medical product, used to study a medical product, and can just be software as a standalone device. And there are several different types of software regulations and guidance documents from FDA that cover digital health. So software as a medical device is software that's intended to be used for medical purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. It can transform a medical platform into a regulated medical device. It connects existing devices, so blood pressure cuffs, glucose monitors. Those can be software that's a medical device, but it connects another medical device. A couple of examples of that are software that processes uterine contractions and fetal heart rate data for remote monitoring of labor progress. And then, as I said before, any kind of a software that would connect to a blood glucose meter. So those would be regulated by FDA as a software as a medical device. Then there's this whole area that FDA describes as enforcement discretion, which is an interesting phrase to use to describe this. So software that falls under enforcement discretion means it's typically low to moderate risk software types, and FDA does not require any kind of a 510K or a de novo 510K because they believe it poses a very low risk to the public. However, they reserve the right to, at some point, enforce some discretion. But there's thousands of products that fall under this enforcement discretion. So some examples I have there are functions that would display and aggregate personal health incidents, or educational information or reminders, general health and wellness, dietary, physical activity software. Those all fall under this enforcement discretion regulation. And then the last one I'll talk about is the clinical decision support software. Excuse me. So it's clinical decision support software are software that's intended to display, analyze, or print medical information, intended for the purpose of supporting or providing recommendations to a healthcare professional. So that would be software that's taking a patient's information and providing those recommendations for treatment decisions to a healthcare professional. And then that's split up into device clinical decision software and then non-device clinical decision software. It gets into a very, very gray area. One example of a non-device clinical decision software are software that uses a patient's diagnosis to provide their healthcare practitioner with current practice treatment guidelines. So what that means is it's giving patients information to their healthcare practitioner, but it's only providing general guidelines to that healthcare practitioner. It's not saying you need to do treatment X or treatment Y. It's just saying these are the general guidelines associated with this. That's the difference between a non-device clinical decision support software and a clinical decision support software device. I encourage everybody, if you're interested in the digital space, there are several FDA guidance documents that spell out these definitions and these regulations. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to what's going on in the United States during the COVID-19 pandemic and what has FDA done to address this. So it was February 4th that the FDA declared a public health emergency. And there are two mechanisms by which companies can get their products on the market during this pandemic period. The first mechanism is called the emergency use authorization process. And what that is basically it's a submission process similar to the 510(k) or de novo process, but it's an abbreviated process. It addresses the applicability of your product or technology to address COVID-19, includes descriptions, indications, and any testing to support safety and efficacy. So that's the first mechanism, the emergency use authorization process. The second mechanism is, again, it's called exercising enforcement discretion through immediately in effect guidance documents. What that means is all the products in that right box, several of those products in that right box, they have specific guidance documents that have been released by FDA during the pandemic. If a company had a product on the market before the pandemic and they meet this guidance document, they can market those products without getting FDA approval, as long as they comply with everything in that what's called an immediately in effect guidance document. So ventilators fit that bill, respirators, disinfectants and sterilants, patient monitoring equipment, thermometers, and then personal protective equipment. So those are the two ways companies can get on the market. Again, that right box talks about all the devices that were in the market before the pandemic. And if they comply with the guidance document, they can go right to market without notifying FDA. On the left side is the emergency use authorization process. So there are several conditions of the emergency use authorization process that are unlike the typical submissions that we submit to FDA. So we have to submit with an emergency use fact sheets. And what those fact sheets are basically, it's a document that's provided to both the patient and the healthcare practitioner. And it tells those patients what this product is, what it does, what are the benefits and risks, and what are the alternatives to use of that product. So basically what that is saying is that this product is only approved during this pandemic. These are the facts about the product, and these are the alternatives. So a patient doesn't feel pressure to use a product that has been approved under emergency use authorization. Some of the other conditions of the EUA are limited test requirements, meaning FDA is not looking for full-blown safety and efficacy testing that they would look for say, for a de novo 510K or a PMA. They are compromising on safety and efficacy testing only because of the pandemic. But they are still looking for safety and efficacy testing. There has to be some level of assurance to FDA that the product will be safe and is effective. The companies are also required to monitor and report adverse events for their products that are approved under an EUA. There are also limitations to distribution and advertising, again, because it's a pandemic. FDA wants to make sure that these products are only going to be used for the COVID-19 patients. And then lastly, when the emergency use authorization is over, is when the pandemic and then the public health emergency has been declared over. I'm not sure when that's going to be. I would imagine it's at least a year or two away. So companies are still continuing to move forward with submitting EUAs to the FDA. And this graphic just talks about the EUA process. You know, FDA enacted the public health emergency in February. They declared it. And when companies, you first go in, when you first submit an EUA, it's really considered a pre-EUA. And FDA looks at it to make sure it's appropriate for this pandemic. And that pre-EUA process can take a couple of weeks before they move it into a formal EUA. Then they go through the formal EUA process. There's a lot of interactive discussion while FDA is reviewing the EUA. They come back with questions. They may look for more testing. So it's a fairly interactive process while they're reviewing your EUA. And then it's either approved or rejected. And again, the approval is terminated once the public health emergency has been terminated by the Food and Drug Administration. Okay, so just moving on to in vitro diagnostics, which the pathway is similar for other types of devices. Again, there's a lot of information on the FDA website in terms of diagnostic device guidance for EUA submissions. However, this is a little different than other types of devices with the emergency use authorization pathway. Diagnostic companies, if they, again, comply with the diagnostic guidance document from FDA on the EUA and what to put into their EUA, they can actually go right to market. So they are somewhere in the middle between the enforcement discretion guidance documents and the full EUA pathway, meaning if you have a diagnostic and you comply with the FDA guidance document for the EUA, those companies can go right to market, but they have to submit their EUA within 15 days of commercializing that diagnostic. So they don't have to wait for an EUA approval. They can go right to market, and then they submit their EUA to FDA. And FDA can come back with questions, and they can pull their product off the market if they disagree with what's in that EUA. But that's the difference between the diagnostic EUA and other types of products EUAs. So for laboratory developed tests, those are diagnostics or various in vitro diagnostic tests for which the test is done at a laboratory or a clinic or a doctor's office, but the processing or analysis of that test is only done in one laboratory. They have to comply with the diagnostic EUA, and then there are specific restrictions that are exerted from different states, have different restrictions on these laboratory developed tests. So there's typically no FDA interaction required for a laboratory developed test, but again, there are some restrictions state to state. So just a couple of highlights of FDA's activities. You know, they've been very, very busy working very hard, I would say in the last several months. They have currently authorized about 287 diagnostic tests. That includes molecular tests, antibody tests, and antigen tests. And they're continuing to monitor different types of testing and working with manufacturers to get these types of tests through. They're monitoring the food supply chains as well as any other products coming in internationally. They've added about 90 ventilator and accessories to the emergency use authorization process. And there are about almost 600 drug development programs that are in process right now. And they've reviewed more than 270 potential therapies that are hopefully going to treat and manage COVID-19. The FDA has identified, I think it's about almost 2,000 fraudulent and unproven medical products related to COVID-19. I'm sure that we've all seen on the internet that there's always something new out there, and FDA is monitoring, they are monitoring those types of situations. And that they have an operation that looks at websites, social media posts. They do online tracking for all of these types of products that are fraudulent and selling to consumers. And then just some recent updates and activities as well. You know, in August, there had to be a guidance document that provided information to consumers on use of UV lights and lamps during COVID-19. They did issue an emergency use authorization for convalescent plasma to treat COVID-19, although there are certainly some mixed reviews on that. In August, there was an EUA for remdesivir, which also helps to manage patients with COVID. And I think that actually has been expanded just in the last couple of weeks. I think in October, they broadened the scope even further for use of remdesivir. In September, they issued a guidance document on clinical trials for COVID-19 medical products. Just the other day, they approved 2 generic drugs to facilitate tracheal intubation. I think it's to help relax the skeletal muscles during intubation and mechanical ventilation. And then on October 22nd, they held a public meeting about the vaccines. What the progress is on vaccines. And then in the last 3 weeks, they have required companies to provide educational materials that are targeted for culturally and linguistically tailored for diverse consumers to make sure that all consumers in the United States have an understanding of COVID-19, what their opportunities and options are for treatment and management and testing. And then also there is still a shortage in the United States of personal protective equipment, testing supplies, and ventilation related products. So if any of these types of products get submitted to FDA through an EUA, they do go through even more of an expedited and a priority review with the FDA. This is just a graphic of everything that FDA has done. FDA released this just a couple of weeks ago about the number of emails that they've looked at and answered, and the products that they've reviewed, and the guidance documents they've released. So it is a pretty impressive list of documentations, authorizations, and activities that FDA has been working on since March. And then lastly, in terms of COVID and, what is the best practice? What is the best way to move forward if you had a product to address COVID? So if you thought you might want to go through the emergency use authorization, I would encourage you to utilize the FDA website and communicate with FDA even before you submit an emergency use authorization. FDA has never been so responsive. I've sent several emails to various groups in CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and they respond very quickly with good, valuable information on an EUA and whether or not an EUA is appropriate for your device type. So communication is key. It's critical to moving forward. Again, with an EUA, like I said before, FDA does compromise on safety and efficacy. They won't look for full-blown safety and efficacy studies. However, it will look for some level of evidence to show that your product is safe and effective. If you do get an EUA approval, you will gain clinical experience with this product, which will be helpful when you do want to submit a 510K or a De Novo 510K. And then if you get an EUA approval, FDA is familiar with your product. That will again put it in a better position once this pandemic is over, or once the public health emergency is over and the EUA is pulled, meaning you can't commercialize anymore. FDA will be familiar with that product once you submit a traditional 510K. And then there are some advantages to just going the traditional pathway because your clearance is permanent. So even if you go into FDA right now with a 510K or De Novo 510K for a technology that addresses COVID-19, it can still be cleared through the traditional 510K pathway, and clearance is permanent. Unlike with an EUA, you'll have to follow that up with another 510K. You have to comply with all the data requirements in the traditional pathways, 510Ks and De Novos. And again, those technologies can still be used for COVID patients. So those are the advantages and disadvantages of moving forward with an EUA versus a traditional 510K or De Novo pathway for your technologies. And that is all I have. I am going to turn it over to Deepak, who will be talking about digital health reimbursement.
Thank you, Mary. Before I move on to the digital health and reimbursement, I just want to check with Peter and Marlena, how are we doing with the time? Because I see a lot of questions out there, and Mary and Aude with their sessions have covered a lot of ground. So I just want to be respectful for everyone's questions too.
So Deepak, thank you for checking in. We've got about 15 minutes left in the session. I'd like to leave a sort of good 10 minutes for questions, if that's possible. As you say, there are some good questions coming up in the chat bar. So if you could cover your ground in about 5 minutes, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Peter. So before we move into the digital health and reimbursement, since there is a lack of time, I would encourage everyone, if they have any additional question, to reach out to us directly through Peter. I'm happy to answer those. I'll go briefly and I'll tell you about those. These are the three components that are required in the US healthcare system for you to have access to reimbursement: coding, coverage, and payment. What I want to drive attention to is to the specific case of telemedicine and the codes that came pre-pandemic, that matured during pandemic, and how it went through. What you are seeing in this slide is the kind of patient flow and how the patient flow changed with the injection of telemedicine. And we are all aware of this. So without spending too much of time over here, I'll go to this part of the coding. So this is in a traditional workflow. When you go in front of the hospitals, you go and visit a doctor and you do your checkups and you do your things, you get invoked of all this CPT codes. So you can read it in your time, what other CPT codes are being invoked. Interestingly, when you move to the next slide, when you go to be a part of telehealth services, you have a different set of code settings that is being getting reimbursed. There are three important factors to remember when you are invoking this telemedicine codes. You need to be an approved FDA device. So that's the first criteria. And that's why Mary and I generally tag team together in many of these conversations. If you are not an approved medical device with a class 1, you cannot be exempt and get access to these codes. Secondly, along with anything that you want to measure remotely, you need to have capabilities to measure physiological parameters like body weight, blood pressure, sugar level, oximeters, all those. Now, you do not need to integrate them. If you have a digital health application, you need to provide that field for the patients to fill that up themselves. They can use any device they want to, because these codes are a substitution of when you go for a physical examination. Whatever the doctor does, they can do it using this application, and you can, and the doctor can do whatever they do face to face over a digital media. So you need to have those capabilities built into your app, or your or any digital media that you are thinking for enabling telehealth. Third, and the most important characteristics over here, is you need to plan your pricing accordingly. You do not want to go into a pricing situation when you are kind of overshooting what is available in the reimbursement code. The good news is, in this reimbursement code, once you study it carefully, there are opportunities for you when you have a new technology establishment or a new technology procurement. There is the code that covers that. So if you are, let's say, deciding your app to be $50, you know where it is. There is also an avenue in which there is a training component involved between physician and patients. So if you say to the physician that I'm going to provide you a training component along with my digital health app, they can take on that, and will go to the, and you can charge higher for your device. So those three components, being an FDA approved device, having physiological parameters, and the third is you're taking the pricing into consideration. Now, since we have 2 minutes left, so these are the coverage that Aude covered. So it shows you how the coverage in the US is being determined. This is the kind of a graph that shows where the telehealth is being covered in the US by commercial payers, and where it is not. It's also it's based on a state by state basis. So if there are states which are in gray where the telehealth is not yet covered, those are not the markets for you to go or think about reimbursement. Coding the you're never for. The slide that I would like to focus is uh, this one. So we did a project on a N1 migraine app. It's related to the mental health. And we looked at how over a period of 1 year, if you do a physical visit to the doctor and different CPT codes get applied to you, what are the chances of the total cost to the physician practice, like to the payers, the physician billing the payers. Similarly, we looked at when there is a new workflow based on your telehealth, what is an opportunity for the physicians to actually go and bill. It is critical for you to understand the patient flow and apply this reimbursement codes, because at the onset, when you go and sell your device to a physician always feels that a telehealth means an opportunity for a lesser reimbursement by adoption of technologies, and they would rather feel comfortable for patients visiting them, and that has impeded the adoption of digital health and telehealth in the US. But if you look over a continuum of care and you can put a story in front of the doctor that using telehealth, you are not only improving patients' health, but it gives you a time to upcharge also, manage the patients better over a period of 1 year. That will in fact lead to a better adoption of your technology. Over a period of time, it has been proven that when you use this technology, the overall cost of the system goes down. But for the initial adoption, you need to convince the physician who is going to buy your, or physician practice who is going to buy your digital health application, that there is a value story and an economic story for them too. Having said those, since we are at 10:50, I just want to drive one message home. For you should not look at your digital health technology independent of a regulatory strategy. Your regulatory and market access strategy for digital health go hand in hand. Secondly, never underestimate the physician's power in adoption of your technology. You will hear a lot of buzzwords around COVID is around, telehealth is gonna pick up, people are gonna recommend it. There was initial surge, pretty good, but right now the cost of Wi-Fi in the US is not as the cost of the Wi-Fi in the UK. We pay $45 on an average for 1 GB of data, and half of the population cannot afford Wi-Fi. So how can they do telehealth? So think from that perspective. So it's not the identical market that it's a technology, everyone will start using it and it will get adopted. So go strategically, get your FTA and reimbursement aligned, and think about it. Happy to discuss. We got just 5 minutes today, but if you have questions, happy to go across and discuss along with Mary and Aude the different aspects over here. Peter, back to you.
Great, Deepak, thank you. And thank you to Mary and Aude as well too for a fantastic presentation. Very clear to me as a novice on this that the US healthcare market is a complicated place. So thank you, all of you, for shedding some light on that. I'm going to go through some of the questions in the chat bar, starting by just reassuring everybody that email contact details for Alira for the DIT team in Boston will be circulated, as well as I think a copy of the presentation, and the recording will also be available. So don't worry if you've missed something. The first question is from Leslie Lindsay. Leslie says that they use software via Bluetooth to control the movements of an electromechanical device. What level of examination of the software or code should they expect for a Class 1 device?
So it depends on the level of risk of what that device is. Software embedded into a medical device has to comply with a specific guidance document, and the lower risk the product is, the least amount of documents you need to provide to FDA. But at a minimum, you would have to do verification and validation and software design specs and requirement specs and that kind of thing. But there's an entire FDA guidance document that is based on the risk of the software used in the product.
But Peter, before that, you need to find out whether that software, when applied within the hospital system, is actually adding value in terms of saving cost. So if you do not, let's say, as Leslie rightly writes, that sees into the respiration system, that is easier for clinical staff to breathe as opposed to mask and goggles. So you have to prove a theory behind what is currently being used and whether that technology adds value. If not, even if you have a great regulatory pathway or a lower regulatory pathway, it will be difficult, because a lot of technology is getting bombarded into the hospital system right now as we speak.
Great. Thank you both very much, Leslie. I hope that answers your question. Coming on to the second question in the chat bar from Jamie Shaw. Jamie asks whether a UK company can register their device directly with the FDA, or do they have to use a local US company or set up a local entity in the market?
Yeah, a UK company can register directly with the FDA, but once you do get an approval or a clearance, then you do have to register your establishment with the FDA. You have to have a US agent, and you have to list the products that you will be commercializing. But you can absolutely go directly to FDA. You don't have to have a liaison when you're in the submission process.
Great, Mary. Thank you. Very clear. Next question is from Syra. Syra says, when we are referring to software, does this include quote-unquote products such as assessment or accreditation engines for apps or web-based digital health solutions?
Again, that depends on what the product does. I mean, if there's software in a digital app and it falls into that general health and wellness category, then that will fall under this enforcement discretion, meaning there's no FDA approval needed. But again, it really depends on the risk level of the product, and is the software integral to what the function is.
Super, thank you. Now, Leslie has got a couple of questions about EUAs, and I wanted to just kind of bracket all of this together with a question of mine. So several questions in a bunch. How long does it take roughly to get an EUA approved? And what are the kind of approval rates? Do you know what sort of percentages we're seeing of the number of applications versus the number of applications that are approved? And then Leslie has asked, what happens when the EUA runs out? Do you have to pull your product off the market perhaps until you've gone through the 510K process. So if you a view on all of that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. So the timing for an EUA is really up in the air. I mean, it's supposed to be expedited, but I have had some cases where it's taken 6-8 weeks or longer. I've had one pending for about 9 weeks. So they can take anywhere between 3 to 4 weeks to a couple of months. So it's really hard to predict how long the EUA process will take. And again, I think FDA is prioritizing the products that are most needed. What is the unmet need out there? They prioritize those, and then they go to the other the products in the EUA. So it can take a good amount of time. What happens when the EUA, the emergency use is over, the pandemic, the public health emergency has been declared over, is that you do have to pull your products off the market. I'm sure there will be a grace period for getting products off the market, but then you have to follow that up with a traditional 510K or de novo, depending on whatever your device does.
Peter, I can add a couple of thoughts regarding the market. I was working with one of the transport respiratory companies who got EUA application here in the US in their market adoption. In early July and August, there was a huge uptick in the market. But after that, when we are approaching the East Coast, the hospital systems, even if they have EUA approval, are asking them to go through traditional 510K before they can buy it. Whereas in the areas where there is a surge of COVID, since it is required and they have EUA application, some hospital systems are buying it. So what happens, even if you are under EUA and EUA is not expired and you go into the hospital system where they're not seeing a surge of the COVID, they will force you to go into a traditional 510K before they can take a decision on the procurement side of it. So EUA gives you a first step into the market, approach to the customers who are struggling, but it is not an entire market entry strategy. That should be there. And hospitals have realized that and are forcing the technologies who have got EUA to go and get the 510K or de novo or PMA, whatever it is, before they can take a long-term procurement decision.
And let me just interject quickly, is I've had a lot of communication with FDA, and what I do is I will get in touch with the appropriate review division at FDA when I'm about to submit an EUA or just to communicate about it. And they will tell me that if there's a specific type of device, that there's already enough of those on the market. So for instance, we were going to go in with a remote monitoring system. They told us not to submit an EUA. They wouldn't even accept it. They said, just submit the traditional 510K, and then you have long-term clearance for approval.
Great. Mary, Deepak, thank you very much. I don't see any further questions in the chat bar, and given the time, I think we will draw things to a conclusion here. I just wanted to, Mary, Aude, Deepak, thank you very, very much indeed for illuminating the US healthcare sector so well. I've learned a huge amount, and I'm sure our attendees have done so too. Thank you also to Marlena for running everything like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. Very well done, Marlena. It worked extremely smoothly, so thank you. Thank you also to my team, the Department for International Trade here in Boston, for working with Alira on this webinar. And thank you to all of you for joining us from across the United Kingdom and the US. Thank you very much for coming in on the day after the election, much appreciated. And just to reassure everybody, the slides will be circulated. Contact details for the speakers and for my team at DIT here in Boston will also be circulated, and this has been recorded, so I think that will also be circulated too, so you can go back over the conversation and check anything that you've missed. So thank you all very much. It's been a real pleasure to join you this morning, and I wish you all a very good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.